Have you ever traveled across the country believing you were about to surprise the people you loved most, only to realize the surprise was actually waiting for you? I didn't come to New York that Christmas Eve because I was lonely or desperate or confused. I came because something inside me still believed that family meant doors opening, not lights turning off. I had taken a red-eye flight from Arizona, the kind that leaves your body exhausted but your heart awake, clutching a small red suitcase like it carried more than clothes because it did. Inside were cookies baked by hands that ached from arthritis, a scarf knitted stitch by stitch for a granddaughter who had probably grown since the last time I saw her, and a quiet hope I never said out loud. The snow was falling gently when I stepped onto their street, the kind of snow that makes everything look forgiving, as if the world itself is trying to soften what's about to happen. Every house glowed warmly, windows lit like promises, laughter leaking into the night, and for a moment I told myself this was exactly how Christmas Eve was supposed to feel. I adjusted my coat, straightened my scarf, and reminded myself not to ring the bell too eagerly, not to look like I was begging for welcome. When I pressed the doorbell, the sound echoed once, clean and polite, and then I waited, smiling to myself as I imagined the surprise on their faces, imagined small feet running, imagined arms opening. Instead, what I heard was laughter upstairs, glasses clinking, music playing softly, and then voices. Voices I recognized even before my heart could brace for them. A woman's voice asked who was at the door, and then my son answered, his voice low but sharp, the way it gets when he's irritated and doesn't want to be. "Pretend we're not home," he said. "I can't deal with this tonight. There are moments when time doesn't slow down, it shatters, and that was one of them." I stood there with my hand still resting on the handle of my suitcase, my breath fogging the cold glass of the door, listening as he continued, explaining that his mother acts like she still has a place in his life, like she still matters, and that tonight was not the night for her. The words didn't sound angry, which somehow hurt more. They sounded final, practiced, as if he'd been carrying them around waiting for the right moment to use them. I heard blinds being drawn, music turned up slightly louder, the porch light clicking off, and just like that, the house went dark, not because the power was gone, but because I had been erased from it. I didn't knock again, didn't ring the bell a second time, didn't plead or announce myself or remind anyone of who I was, because something inside me understood that once you hear the truth through a closed window, you don't beg for it to be rewritten. I stepped back slowly, my boots crunching against fresh snow, and that sound felt louder than it should have, like the night itself was paying attention. As I turned to leave, the zipper on my suitcase shifted slightly and the top flap opened just enough for the corner of a manila folder to peek out, pale against the red fabric, and I knelt down to close it, my hands shaking not from the cold, but from clarity settling in where hope had been. That folder wasn't supposed to be with me on the sidewalk. It wasn't supposed to be near snow or silence or rejection. It was meant to be handed over quietly, without speeches or gratitude, a blessing disguised as paperwork. I had imagined giving it to him that night, imagined saying nothing more than "this is yours," because that's how I had always loved, quietly, without demanding recognition. But kneeling there in the snow, listening to laughter continue behind a door that would not open for me, I realized something that changed everything. You cannot give legacy to people who believe you are already finished. I stood up, zipped the suitcase closed, and walked away from the house without looking back, my breath steady, my spine straight, my heart surprisingly calm. I didn't cry as I reached the corner, didn't break down as the cold seeped through my coat, because tears belonged to confusion and I was no longer confused. I booked a hotel room near Central Park with the same calm precision I once used to solve problems no one ever knew I solved, ordered soup I barely tasted, and sat alone on the edge of the bed, listening to the city hum outside the window. On the desk beside me, I placed the manila folder carefully, smoothing it flat as if it were alive, and for the first time I didn't see it as a gift meant for someone else, but as a choice that still belonged to me. They thought leaving me outside in the snow made them powerful, thought silence was enough to make me disappear, but what they didn't understand was that the quietest moments are often the ones where decisions are made that can never be undone. As I turned off the light and lay back against the pillows, I didn't think about the door that stayed closed. I thought about the years that led to this night, the parts of my life no one had ever bothered to ask about, and I realized that Christmas Eve hadn't taken something from me at all. It had handed me something back. And what I was about to do next would make that closed door the smallest mistake they ever made, because the truth is, they never asked who I was before I became just a mother. And in part two, you'll understand why that question alone could change everything. Have you ever noticed how people decide who you are based only on the version of you that's useful to them and never bother wondering if there was a whole life before that? By the time my son was old enough to form memories, I was already settled into the role the world found most comfortable for me, the mother who was always home, always available, always tired, always quiet. No one ever asked how I filled my days before grocery lists and school pickups, before folded laundry and medical appointments. Before my name slowly disappeared behind the title of mom, it was as if I had only begun existing the day I gave birth, as if the woman I had been before evaporated the moment I held my baby in my arms, and over time, I learned that this disappearance was expected, even encouraged. People spoke to me as though my past were irrelevant, as though nothing meaningful could have happened to me before motherhood, and the strange thing is, when no one asks, you eventually stop offering. I let them believe I had always been this way, domestic, small, predictable, because correcting that assumption felt unnecessary, almost dangerous, in a world that already seemed uneasy when women knew too much. When my son grew older, he never questioned why numbers came easily to me, why I could help him with math problems faster than his teachers, why I stayed calm during financial emergencies that made others panic. He accepted it the way children accept weather, something that simply exists without needing explanation. And I allowed that because invisibility can be a form of safety if you've learned what visibility costs. People don't expect anything from what they don't see, and for years that suited me just fine. I learned to carry entire conversations without ever speaking about myself, learned to deflect curiosity with a smile, learned that the fastest way to make others comfortable was to shrink. When friends asked what I did all day, I told them I kept busy, and they nodded, satisfied as if the details didn't matter. When relatives praised my son's intelligence, I smiled again because it was easier than explaining that intelligence doesn't appear out of nowhere, that it is often inherited, taught, modeled, absorbed in quiet moments no one remembers. I became fluent in understatement, in making my life sound smaller than it was, because when women sound too accomplished, people get uncomfortable, especially when those accomplishments don't fit the narrative they prefer. I watched my son grow into a man who assumed his success was entirely his own, not because he was cruel, but because the world had trained him to see mothers as support systems, not as sources. He saw me as the person who cooked, who cleaned, who paid bills without complaint, who somehow made things work, and he never stopped to wonder how. I don't blame him for that entirely. Children learn what we show them, and I showed him silence. I showed him how to solve equations, but never explained where I learned them. I showed him how to plan, how to think ahead, how to see systems instead of chaos, but I never told him why those skills came so naturally to me. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more permanent that silence became, until one day it felt like history had sealed itself shut. People assume that invisibility happens suddenly, but it doesn't. It happens in layers, each year adding another thin coat of assumption over who you really are, until even you begin to forget how much is buried underneath. By the time my son called me a burden, he wasn't being cruel in his mind. He was being practical because he truly believed there was nothing else to me, no past to honor, no foundation to respect. To him, I was a phase of his life he had outgrown, a responsibility that belonged to an earlier version of himself, and what hurt most wasn't the dismissal, it was the certainty with which he dismissed me. He had no idea that the woman standing outside his house that night was carrying decades of unspoken work, sacrifice, and knowledge that had shaped the very world he now navigated so confidently. And as I sat alone in that hotel room, thinking about how easily I had been reduced to a role I never chose to be trapped in, I realized something that felt both painful and liberating. People can only erase the parts of you they were never told existed. I had helped write my own disappearance by believing my story didn't need to be told. But stories don't vanish, they wait, and the more they are ignored, the more powerful they become when they finally surface. That night, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt alert, as if a switch had been flipped after years of dim light, because once you recognize that your past has been erased, you also recognize that it can be restored. And the truth they never asked about, the life that came before motherhood, the work that shaped me long before I ever packed school lunches, was not ordinary, not forgettable, and not something that could stay hidden forever. Because what they never knew is that before I became invisible, I was trusted with things so precise and so powerful that one mistake could have cost lives. And in part 3, you'll finally understand what was taken from me the moment I became a mother. What if I told you that the most valuable things I ever built were never meant to carry my name, and that I accepted that long before anyone told me I should? Long before I was introduced as someone's mother, long before my days were measured in school schedules and grocery lists, I lived in a world where precision mattered more than personality and mistakes were not forgiven. I was young, barely out of school, when I was accepted into work so quiet and restricted that even speaking about it would have ended it, and I learned quickly that silence was not just encouraged, it was required. I was one of very few women in rooms filled with men who did not expect me to speak, and I discovered that being underestimated gave me an advantage because no one questioned the woman who stayed focused and said little. I worked with numbers that didn't forgive emotion, equations that determined whether machines behaved as intended or failed catastrophically, and I learned to trust logic over validation because validation was never going to come. I wrote and rewrote systems by hand, checked every line, tested every outcome in my head before it ever touched a machine, because when something went wrong in that world, it wasn't embarrassing, it was deadly. I didn't need applause to know I was good at what I did. Accuracy became its own reward. For years, my work existed without my name attached to it, folded into larger projects, absorbed into systems that functioned because they had to, and I accepted that invisibility because I believed in what I was contributing to. Then my body changed, quietly at first, then unmistakably, and suddenly the same rooms that once relied on my work became uncomfortable with my presence. I remember the way conversations shifted when pregnancy could no longer be ignored, the way concern was framed as protection, the way decisions were made for me without ever asking what I wanted. I was told I needed to step away, that stress was dangerous, that my condition made the environment unsuitable, and it was said gently enough that it almost sounded like kindness. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because I understood something they didn't realize they were proving. Once a woman becomes a mother, her competence is treated as optional. I was assured it was temporary, that things would be reconsidered after the birth, and I believed that because believing felt easier than fighting a system that wasn't built to hear me. But temporary became permanent without ceremony, without explanation, without anyone ever admitting a decision had been made. Access quietly disappeared, projects moved forward without me, and one day I realized I was no longer needed because I had been replaced by my absence. There was no dramatic ending, no confrontation, just a slow closing of doors until I found myself on the outside of a life I had helped build. I went home, held my newborn son, and told myself this was just a different chapter, that I would return, that this pause didn't define me. But pauses have a way of stretching when no one is waiting for you to come back. My days filled with caregiving instead of calculations, and while I loved my child deeply, love did not erase the sense that something essential had been taken without my consent. I stopped solving problems that could change outcomes and started solving problems that kept a household running, and the world treated these as interchangeable, as if one naturally replaced the other. I told myself I was lucky, that many women had it worse, that I should be grateful, and over time those justifications hardened into routine. My old tools gathered dust, my notebooks were stored away, and my mind learned to operate in the background, always active but never acknowledged. People praised my sacrifice without realizing it wasn't a choice, and each compliment made the silence heavier. I didn't resent motherhood, I resented the lie that said motherhood erased everything else I had been. And yet I adapted because adaptation is what women like me were taught to do. I found ways to keep my mind sharp in stolen moments, helped others quietly, learned new systems on my own, and never spoke of what I missed because missing it felt selfish in a world that had already decided my role. By the time my son was old enough to notice, I had become an expert at appearing ordinary, and no one questioned that ordinariness because it made sense to them. But brilliance doesn't disappear when it's ignored, it waits, it observes, it stores itself in places no one thinks to look. And while I had been pushed out of one world, I was quietly laying the groundwork for another, one that would eventually support everyone who had stopped seeing me. Because while they believed my work ended when I became a mother, what they never noticed was how much of what I knew was being passed down. And in part 4, you'll see how my silence quietly became the foundation of my son's success. Have you ever watched someone step confidently into a life you quietly built for them, never realizing they were walking on floors you laid down years ago? As my son grew older, the distance between what I knew and what he assumed widened without either of us naming it, and in that silence, something complicated took root. I was the one who sat beside him at the kitchen table when numbers stopped making sense, the one who broke problems down into patterns instead of panic, who showed him how to think instead of what to think, and he absorbed it the way children absorb language without questioning where it came from. He never asked why I could explain concepts so cleanly, why I never needed notes, why I could spot errors before he finished a calculation, because to him I was just his mother, and mothers are expected to know things without explanation. I never corrected that assumption, not because I wanted credit, but because I believed the knowledge mattered more than recognition, and because teaching him felt like continuity, like the work I had lost was finding another way to exist through him. While he learned, I watched, careful not to push too hard, careful not to overshadow, because I had learned long ago that women who appear too capable make people uneasy. So I stayed in the background, nodding, encouraging, letting him believe his confidence was self-made, even as I recognized the familiar shape of my own thinking taking form in his. As he moved forward in life, opportunities seemed to open effortlessly for him, and from the outside it looked like luck or talent or perfect timing. But I knew how much of that momentum came from foundations built quietly, patiently over years. I paid for his education without asking for acknowledgement, helped with down payments without conditions, sent checks that were always cashed but rarely discussed, because love to me had never been transactional. What he didn't see were the long nights I spent balancing accounts after everyone else slept, teaching myself markets through library books and careful observation, investing modest amounts with discipline and restraint, watching them grow slowly, steadily, because patience was something I had always trusted. I learned to live modestly so that resources could work quietly in the background, compounding in ways that didn't require attention, because attention had never been my goal. Over time, those small, deliberate decisions turned into something substantial, something powerful, something I never spoke about because speaking about it would have shifted how people saw me, and I wasn't ready for that yet. My son built a career and a family of his own, and I watched with pride as his confidence solidified into certainty, never realizing that certainty was supported by lessons, habits, and instincts that had been shaped long before he ever took credit for them. He began to speak to me with the casual authority of someone who believes they have outgrown their teacher, offering advice I didn't ask for, assuming I needed guidance simply because I no longer occupied the world he respected. When he told me to take care of myself, to remember my limitations, I nodded because correcting him felt pointless, and because I was still carrying something meant to help him, something I believed would eventually remind him of who I had always been. What he never understood was that while he was building a life in the open, I was maintaining one quietly in reserve, not as leverage, not as a weapon, but as insurance against a world that had taught me never to depend on gratitude. And when he finally called me a burden, when he spoke as though I were something heavy he had been carrying rather than the ground beneath his feet, I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange, almost clinical clarity. Because in that moment, it became obvious that he did not see the full picture, did not understand how deeply intertwined our paths truly were, and had no idea how close he had come to inheriting something that could have changed everything. I realized then that success built without awareness of its origins is fragile, and that the same silence that once protected him was now protecting me. I had spent a lifetime making sure he never fell, and now I understood that sometimes the most important lesson comes when you step back and let someone realize they were never standing alone to begin with. Because the night he shut the door on me, I was still planning to give him everything. And in part 5, you'll finally see what was inside the folder they never bothered to ask about. What would you do if the people who dismissed you were one quiet decision away from inheriting everything you had spent a lifetime protecting? That question followed me back to the hotel room that night like a shadow that refused to leave, because for the first time, I wasn't asking it out of hurt, I was asking it out of control. The manila folder sat on the desk under the lamp, unassuming, almost boring, the kind of thing no one looks twice at, and yet it held more weight than anything I had ever carried in my hands. I had imagined that folder being opened at a kitchen table surrounded by family, imagined saying almost nothing as I slid it across, because real gifts don't need speeches, they need readiness. But readiness requires respect, and that was the one thing they had made clear I no longer had. I sat there listening to the hum of the city outside, realizing how easily generosity turns into entitlement when people forget where it comes from. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask whether giving was still an act of love or simply a habit I had never questioned. Inside the folder were years of discipline condensed into paper, decisions made quietly, investments grown patiently, legal documents prepared carefully, all meant to secure a future I believed I would be welcomed into, even if only on the margins. I had structured everything so that it would arrive without drama, without leverage, without the kind of power that changes how people speak to you, because I had never wanted to be treated differently for what I had, only for who I was. But as I stared at that folder, it became painfully clear that who I was had already been decided for me, and it was a version that didn't include gratitude, curiosity, or even basic acknowledgement. I realized then that giving something so large to people who had already erased me wouldn't make them kinder. It would simply confirm their belief that I existed to provide and disappear. That clarity didn't come with anger or revenge fantasies. It came with calm, the kind of calm that only shows up when denial finally lets go. I opened the folder slowly, not to review its contents, but to remind myself that every page represented choices I had made, risks I had taken, patience I had practiced while the world assumed I had nothing to contribute. I thought about how easily people confuse kindness with weakness, how often generosity is mistaken for obligation, and how quickly respect evaporates when someone believes you have nowhere else to go. In that room, I finally understood that legacy is not about what you give, it's about who you choose to give it to, and that choice still belonged to me. I didn't tear anything up, didn't dramatize the moment, didn't even feel the need to justify myself, because justification is for people seeking permission, and I no longer was. I simply closed the folder, slid it back into the suitcase, and felt something lift that I hadn't known was pressing on me for years. The burden they thought they were carrying had quietly changed hands, and they had no idea it had happened. As I turned off the lamp and lay back against the pillows, I realized that walking away from that door hadn't been an ending at all. It had been a beginning, the moment where silence stopped being something done to me and became something I could use. They believed I left with nothing but hurt, but what I actually left with was authority over my own story, and that authority was far more dangerous than money. Because once you reclaim control, you start asking different questions. And the next question I asked myself was not whether they deserved what I had prepared, but whether the world deserved to finally know where everything really came from. Because the moment I chose not to give them the folder, I chose something else instead. And in part 6, you'll see what happens when silence decides it's time to speak. Have you ever held on to the truth for so long that letting it out feels less like revenge and more like correcting a record that was never meant to stay wrong? The decision didn't come in a burst of anger or a dramatic moment of defiance. It arrived quietly, the way real shifts in power always do, while I sat alone with my old laptop open and realized that silence had already done enough damage. For decades, staying quiet had protected everyone but me, and once I saw that clearly, there was no unseeing it. I opened folders I hadn't touched in years, files labeled with names only I remembered, and as the screen filled with scanned pages, diagrams, handwritten notes, and timestamped records, I felt something steady replace the last traces of hesitation. This wasn't about proving I was right, it was about establishing what was true, because truth doesn't need emotion to function, it needs evidence. I reviewed the work carefully, not out of doubt, but out of respect for precision, comparing what I had created long ago with what now existed in polished, modern form under someone else's name, and the lineage was unmistakable. The structures matched, the logic matched, even the shortcuts were the same, and I recognized my own thinking in ways that felt almost intimate, as if I were reading my younger self's handwriting again. I didn't feel betrayed in that moment. I felt validated because the proof was there, patient and undeniable, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Reaching out for help wasn't easy, not because I feared disbelief, but because asking to be heard after a lifetime of silence feels like learning a new language, and yet I knew exactly who would understand what I was holding. I wrote a short message, attached the files, and pressed send without ceremony because the truth doesn't require theatrics, only witnesses. When the response came, it wasn't shocked or skeptical. It was precise, careful, and unmistakably serious, the kind of response that tells you your story has already begun moving without you. From that point on, things unfolded with a speed that surprised even me, not because the world suddenly became fair, but because once evidence enters the room, denial loses its footing. I didn't call my son, didn't warn him, didn't issue ultimatums, because this was no longer a family matter. It was a matter of record, and records don't negotiate. Watching events set themselves in motion felt surreal, like observing a system I had designed finally run on its own. And for the first time, I wasn't responsible for managing the outcome. I slept better than I had in years, not because I felt victorious, but because carrying the truth alone had finally ended. Silence had served its purpose, and now it was stepping aside, not with a scream, but with a file upload and a timestamp. The story was no longer mine to control, and oddly enough, that brought relief, because I had spent a lifetime controlling outcomes for others, and it was time to let facts do the work for me. What I didn't know then was how quickly truth travels once it's released, or how many people were waiting for a story like mine to finally be told. Because when the truth went public, it didn't just change my life, it dismantled the world my son thought was untouchable. And in part 7, you'll see what happens when success built on silence starts to collapse. What happens when the world finally looks at something everyone else was told not to question. The shift was subtle at first, almost polite, the kind of change you only notice if you're paying attention, but once it began, it moved with a momentum that no amount of damage control could stop. I watched from a distance as conversations changed tone, as admiration gave way to hesitation, and as the same confidence my son once carried so easily began to fracture under scrutiny he had never expected to face. Statements were issued, carefully worded and empty of substance, filled with admiration for my past and vague references to misunderstandings. But facts don't respond to tone, they respond to comparison, and the comparisons were devastating. Documents that had once lived quietly on my laptop were now being examined by people trained to spot patterns, and those patterns led straight back to me, line after line, decision after decision, logic after logic. Investors grew cautious, then restless, then distant, because trust is a fragile thing when it's built on assumptions rather than proof. Projects were paused, partnerships quietly dissolved, and the image he had spent years curating began to unravel without a single accusation needing to be raised by me. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this happen, only a steady sense of inevitability, the kind you feel when a system behaves exactly as designed. For the first time, my son was forced to exist without the benefit of unquestioned belief, and I realized how much belief had carried him when knowledge alone could not. Institutions that once celebrated him began asking questions they should have asked long ago, and those questions multiplied faster than answers could be prepared. He was no longer responding, he was reacting, and reaction is never a position of strength. Requests for clarification turned into reviews, reviews turned into inquiries, and inquiries have a way of widening until they reveal everything hiding in their path. I remained silent throughout, not because I was afraid to speak, but because speaking was no longer necessary, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part for everyone involved. I had spent years being invisible, and now my absence from the noise only made the evidence louder. Watching the collapse wasn't painful, but it wasn't triumphant either. It felt like witnessing a long-delayed consequence finally arriving on schedule. I thought about the night he told me to pretend I didn't exist, and I wondered if he understood now how dangerous it is to build something while ignoring the truth beneath it. Reputation doesn't fall apart all at once, it erodes piece by piece until one day there's nothing left to stand on. And as his world contracted, mine grew unexpectedly expansive, filled with messages from people who recognized parts of their own stories in mine, people who had been told to stay quiet, to stay grateful, to stay small. The story was no longer just about me or him, it had become a mirror, and mirrors are uncomfortable because they don't lie. What none of us could predict was how far that reflection would reach, or what would happen when the world decided not just to question the past, but to correct it. Because as his foundation collapsed, something I never expected began to rise. And in part 8, you'll see how being erased turned into a legacy no one could ever take away. What if the moment that broke you was actually the moment that finally put your name back where it always belonged? I didn't expect recognition, and I certainly didn't wait for apology, because by the time the world began to speak my name, I no longer needed either to feel whole. Invitations arrived slowly at first, then with certainty, not because I demanded attention, but because history has a way of correcting itself when enough light is applied. I stood in rooms I was never meant to return to, not as an assistant or a background presence, but as someone whose work had shaped outcomes long before applause existed, and I realized how little noise true acknowledgement actually makes. Standing at a podium years later, looking out at faces that reflected curiosity rather than dismissal, I spoke not of anger or betrayal, but of silence, of how easily it becomes mistaken for absence, and how dangerous that misunderstanding can be. I spoke about the cost of being brilliant in a world that prefers women to be agreeable, about motherhood not as an ending, but as a chapter that should never erase the ones that came before it. The room listened in a way I had not been listened to before, and in that listening, I felt something settle that had been restless for decades. I didn't rebuild relationships that had already taught me who they were, and I didn't chase reconciliation for the sake of appearances, because peace does not require permission from the people who denied you respect. My days became quieter in the best possible way, filled with teaching those who were curious rather than dismissive, watching understanding bloom in people who had been told it was too late for them, and feeling my past finally integrate with my present instead of competing with it. When my granddaughter reached out, not as a child repeating what she had been told, but as a young mind discovering who I was on her own terms, I answered with honesty and restraint because legacy is not about correcting the past, it's about shaping what comes next. I learned that justice doesn't always arrive as punishment, sometimes it arrives as clarity, as truth spoken calmly and received completely. The door that closed on me that night in the snow no longer holds any weight in my life because what was behind it was never meant to contain me. I didn't need to win against anyone to move forward. I simply needed to stop carrying what was never mine to bear. Being overlooked taught me patience, being underestimated taught me precision, and being erased taught me the value of keeping records, of remembering who you are even when no one asks. My name now exists where it should have all along, not because I demanded it, but because it endured, and endurance, I've learned, is the most honest form of power. I don't tell this story for sympathy or applause, but as a reminder that invisibility is not the same as insignificance, and that silence, when chosen instead of imposed, can become a tool rather than a wound. They thought pretending I wasn't home would make me disappear, but all it did was send me back to myself, to a life that was always bigger than the door they closed. And if there is one truth I carry forward now, it's this. Being remembered is not about being loud, it's about being undeniable. The door stayed shut, but the story finally opened.